On July 9th, 1976, a quiet, peaceful camping trip in Wisconsin turned into a horrific crime scene that would haunt a community for over 4 decades. David and Ellen, engaged to be married, were shot and left for dead in McClintock Park. No one knew then, but this would be a mystery that would take 43 years to solve. Before we go on, if you believe every family deserves answers, even if it takes decades, please hit the subscribe button. Cases like this get forgotten unless people like you keep their stories alive. David Schuldes and Ellen Matheys were the kind of couple everyone envied. Young, vibrant, and full of life, they were engaged to be married, dreaming of a future together that seemed as promising as the summer sky above them. Their love for the outdoors was one of the things that brought them closer. Hiking, camping, and taking in the beauty of Wisconsin's landscapes were their shared passions. McClintock Park, nestled just outside of Wausau, seemed like the perfect spot for a weekend getaway before the whirlwind of wedding plans would take over. The park was peaceful, almost otherworldly, with its towering trees and the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a soft orange glow across the sky, the couple set up their campsite near the quiet shores of a small lake, where the only sounds were the calls of distant birds and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. They joked and laughed as they worked together, making dinner and setting up their tent under the expanse of stars. There was no rush, no distractions, just the simplicity of being in each other's company, surrounded by the calming embrace of nature. David, at 25, was a man who had everything ahead of him. He was a hard worker, with a genuine smile and a contagious laugh. Ellen, just 24, had an equally bright future in front of her. She was kind-hearted, passionate, and had a way of making everyone feel special. Their families were already making plans for their wedding, eagerly anticipating the life they were about to begin. They were the couple who radiated joy, the kind that made everyone around them believe in the magic of love. Yet, on that evening, as the stars began to the sky above McClintock Park, no one could have known how quickly everything would change. The air was crisp with the coolness of early summer, and the park was eerily quiet as the couple settled in for the night. The peaceful surroundings of McClintock Park gave little hint of the tragedy that would unfold in the hours to come. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling as if whispering secrets no one could hear. It was a perfect evening, or so it seemed. There was an unspoken tranquility in the air, a calm that, in hindsight, would only make the violence that followed feel all the more unnatural. As David and Ellen prepared to rest, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The lake reflected the stars, and the forest remained still, as if nature itself had decided to give them this one last perfect moment before the inevitable destruction of their peace. But beneath the serenity, an unsettling sense of foreboding began to creep in, one that would not become clear until much later. The stillness of the park was soon broken, but not by the sound of nature. It would be broken by a shocking act of violence, a crime that would remain unsolved for 43 years. David's family described him as a quiet, thoughtful young man who had always been a source of pride. His parents, who had been watching their son grow into a man ready to begin his own family, could never have imagined that their son's future would be stolen from him in such a cruel way. Ellen's family, too, was devastated. Ellen had been the light of their lives, always caring, always full of laughter. Her mother often recalled how Ellen's bright smile could lift anyone's spirits, how she was so full of life and promise. Both families shared a deep bond, united in their grief and confusion. The couple's tragic death shattered not just their lives, but the lives of everyone who knew them. The love David and Ellen shared wasn't just felt by them. It rippled outward, touching all who had the privilege of knowing them. What would drive someone to murder a young couple with no apparent motive? Keep watching as we dive deeper into this unsolved mystery. Morning came quietly over McClintock Park. The sun filtered through the trees in soft beams, illuminating patches of ground and casting long shadows across the forest floor. To anyone passing by, it was just another peaceful Wisconsin summer morning. But near a shaded trail off the lake's edge, the stillness hid something no one was prepared to face. A local man hiking the park alone, someone who had walked those trails countless times, was the first to notice that something wasn't right. From several feet away, a shape on the ground caught his attention. At first, he assumed someone was asleep, maybe a camper resting outside their tent. But the closer he got, the more the reality pressed in. He froze mid-step. There was no movement, no shifting, no breathing, just silence. David lay face down on the ground, arms at his sides, as if he had been caught off guard. His shirt was torn just slightly, and the earth beneath him carried the unmistakable stain of blood. The hiker stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. Panic rose in him. Panic not fueled by fear, but by disbelief. This kind of thing didn't happen here. Not in McClintock. Not to young people just trying to enjoy a night under the stars. When he gathered himself enough to call for help, he noticed something else. Movement just past the trees. Not movement of a person. Just something catching the light. He stepped slowly toward it and saw the second body. Ellen was lying on her side, not far from the first sight. Her hand was curled near her chest, her body slightly turned, as if she had tried to react, perhaps run, perhaps reach for help. She, too, had been shot. Most people watching this video will move on with their day. David and Ellen never got that chance. If you're still here listening to their story, hit the like button so YouTube shows it to more people who might care too. The hiker fell silent again, this time not from shock alone, but from the weight of what the scene represented. 2 lives stopped in their prime. A moment frozen. News traveled quickly through the small rural community. Officers, paramedics, and rangers arrived on the scene in waves. Yellow tape soon cut across the greenery, leaving a stark and unnatural scar on the landscape. The responders moved carefully, but there was no hiding the confusion on their faces. They were trained to stay composed, but even they struggled to understand what they were dealing with. Detectives examined the site methodically. Cameras clicked quietly as investigators captured every angle, every footprint, every detail. They checked the couple's tent. The flap was closed. Their belongings were untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, no scattered supplies. Their wallets and personal items were still there. The campsite looked almost staged in its order, like nothing terrible had happened just a few feet away. One officer murmured, "Why would someone do this, just to walk away empty-handed?" No one had an answer. The working theory of robbery was dismissed almost immediately. There were no tire tracks nearby, no evidence of someone camping close enough to be bothered by noise, no known disputes connected to David or Ellen. There were no eyewitnesses and no apparent motive. Even the direction of the gunshots raised more questions than they answered. Whoever pulled the trigger had acted with certainty. There was no sign of hesitation or panic afterward. Detectives spread out along the surrounding trails, marking even the smallest disturbances. Shoe prints were checked, compared, photographed. Rangers searched the waterline for discarded weapon parts. Volunteers combed through the woods in a widening ring, trying to locate anything that might connect to the crime. Nothing surfaced. David's truck, parked not far from the entrance to the campsite, offered just as little clarity. The doors were locked. A cooler was still inside, untouched. A folded map rested neatly in the console. Their weekend had barely begun. As the day wore on, the gravity of the situation deepened. McClintock Park wasn't a crowded campground with constant traffic. It was remote and quiet. People didn't just pass through, they came intentionally. If someone had camped nearby, they would have seen something. But there were no reports of screams, gunshots, or late-night arguments. No one heard or saw anything unusual. The responding sheriff stepped aside and looked out over the woods for a long moment. How does someone walk into a place like this, do something like this, and disappear without a trace? He asked no one in particular. The question hung heavy over the scene. Families were contacted later that afternoon. Officers drove to their homes rather than calling. News of this magnitude couldn't be delivered by phone. And when the knocks came, the world of 2 families collapsed instantly. Parents who had been preparing for a wedding suddenly received the kind of news no one is ever ready for. The shock was so sharp it barely registered, and then the grief began. Back at the crime scene, law enforcement worked into the fading light. Flashlights cut through the bushes. Evidence bags stacked steadily. Radios crackled with check-ins and updates, although there were few updates to give. Darkness crept over the woods, and officers started packing up for the night, knowing they would return at first light. Still, nothing pointed to why this happened. A couple who harmed no one. A quiet campsite. No sign of self-defense, struggle, or theft. Investigators couldn't shake it. the scene didn't make sense. It was as if someone approached, fired, and vanished. No warning. No reason. Even before forensic reports came in, the frustration was already settling in the minds of detectives. They had seen difficult cases before, but this felt like a dead end on day one. No patterns, no conflict, no clues. The randomness of it was almost harder to handle than a clear motive. And yet, something about the scene suggested intention. The precision of the assault, the lack of hesitation, the choice of location. Investigators knew one thing for certain. Whoever did this had not stumbled into the campground accidentally. That thought alone would keep the case open for decades. Could there be a personal connection to the murders, or was it just an act of pure violence? What do you think happened here? Let us know in the comments. The first 48 hours after the discovery of the bodies became a blur of questions without answers. Detectives sat around desks filled with handwritten notes, satellite photos of McClintock Park, and lists of anyone who might have crossed paths with the couple in the days before the trip. They were determined to find some thread. Something, anything, that could explain what had happened. But for every theory they explored, there seemed to be twice as many reasons it didn't fit. The first working theory was robbery. It was the most common motive for violence in remote campgrounds, especially when victims were found outdoors rather than inside their tent. Officers examined personal belongings again and again, hoping something had been overlooked. But nothing was missing. Cash was still in wallets. Jewelry was untouched. Ellen's engagement ring, a symbol of the life she was preparing to build, remained on her finger. If someone had come with the intention to steal, they had left empty-handed. That forced investigators to shift to the next possibility, a crime of passion. Was there someone who disapproved of the relationship? A former partner? A co-worker with unresolved romantic feelings? Detectives began reviewing the couple's histories, interviewing co-workers, friends, former classmates, anyone who might provide context. Every question was careful, every meeting uncomfortable. No one wanted to imply that David or Ellen had been unfaithful, but in a case with no physical evidence, emotions and relationships became the only terrain to search. Co-workers described both of them as deeply committed to each other. Friends were quick to shut down even the suggestion of a love triangle. Their connection was the kind others admired. They were affectionate without being boastful, supportive without losing themselves in each other. No friend reported tension, suspicion, or jealousy. Not one person stepped forward claiming there had been conflict in their lives. Another theory, whispered more than spoken, was whether the couple had stumbled across something they shouldn't have seen. There had been no reports of drug activity or suspicious behavior in the park, but investigators searched anyway. They questioned park rangers and hikers. They looked into recent police records from the surrounding towns. Nothing matched the level of violence found at the campsite. One detective framed it bluntly during a briefing. If someone wanted to hide something illegal, why risk a double murder? Why shoot them both and disappear? The room had no response. As summer wore on, the pressure in the police department grew. Families attended every meeting, looking to detectives for progress that simply wasn't there. Reporters stood outside the station waiting for updates, hoping to catch a glimpse of a suspect sketch or a significant breakthrough. Instead, every press conference sounded the same. Ongoing, still investigating, no suspects confirmed, no tips leading anywhere. The community of Marathon County wasn't prepared for something like this. Violent crime was rare. Most residents didn't lock their doors. Children played outside until dark. Sightings of unfamiliar cars became topics of conversation. Local gossip mills churned quietly. A tragedy so sudden and senseless had no natural place in a town where people grew up knowing one another across generations. Church services included moments of silence. Candles were placed near park entrances, gestures of mourning mixed with fear. Friends of the couple avoided McClintock Park altogether. Parents warned their children not to go camping alone. For the first time in memory, a space once considered peaceful now carried a quiet unease. Yet, even in fear, the community refused to accept that this case would remain unsolved. They flooded the sheriff's office with tips. Campers who recalled odd sounds, people who'd seen unfamiliar faces at gas stations, and a few who admitted they thought they'd seen someone walking the trails late at night, but couldn't be sure. Officers followed every lead. None panned out. Frustration settled deeper. Detectives interviewed bystanders multiple times, hoping memories might sharpen with repetition. They even revisited the robbery theory, studying ballistic evidence to see whether another crime in another county involved the same weapon. No links emerged. As weeks became months, momentum slipped away. A case that had started with urgency was gradually overshadowed by the reality that there was nothing to point to. No trail to follow. No enemy to identify. No narrative to explain what had shattered two families. Files began shifting into cold case storage. A label no detective wanted to use, but one that became increasingly unavoidable. Investigators still reviewed the case periodically, hoping time and distance would reveal something they hadn't seen before. But the passage of time brought an unfortunate side effect. Memories faded, attention waned, and witnesses grew less certain. Even the most experienced officers struggled with the emotional toll. They felt responsible, not only for solving the crime, but for easing the pain of two families who had already lost too much. Detectives began to ask themselves questions they weren't prepared for. What if there was no motive? What if it was random? What if it could happen again and no one knew why? Those doubts hardened the case in a way that was difficult to break. With no new leads, the tragedy settled into the painful category of unsolved. Newspapers stopped printing updates. Television crews moved on. And McClintock Park slowly returned to calm, not because fear was gone, but because time forced people to keep living. The families, however, never moved on. They visited the graves, held on to memories, and pushed for the case to remain open. They wrote letters, attended community meetings, and asked detectives to reconsider evidence. They kept the story alive when no one else could. What no one knew. Not the grieving families, not the detectives who fought for answers, not the community left sitting with unanswered questions, was that the evidence needed to solve the case already existed. It was there the moment the crime was committed. It would simply take 43 years for science to catch up to it. What do you think might have been the real motive behind this crime? Was it a crime of passion, or was it something more calculated? Let us know in the comments. Seasons shifted across Wisconsin year after year, but the investigation into the deaths of David and Ellen hardly moved at all. The files stayed open, but the activity inside them slowed. Every so often a detective would revisit photographs, reports, and statements, hoping fresh eyes or distance might reveal something that had been missed. Yet nothing emerged. The crime that had shaken the community had no trail left to follow. As the months turned into years, the case transitioned from active to lingering. Still technically open, still technically active, but no longer fueled by momentum. New cases arrived at the sheriff's office, demanding time and attention. Detectives retired. Personnel changed. McClintock Park returned to being a destination for families and campers, despite how many still whispered the names of David and Ellen when passing the trail where their bodies were found. The silence surrounding the case grew heavier with each passing year. What had once received newspaper headlines eventually became occasional anniversary mentions, brief reminders of a tragedy long unsolved. Reporters reached out less and less. Public curiosity faded, replaced by the quiet resignation that some things simply never get resolved. But for the families, time didn't soften anything. They kept photographs on mantels and framed their engagement announcement in the living room. Holiday dinners always had two empty seats that no one spoke about directly, but everyone acknowledged. Birthdays passed without candles. Wedding anniversaries that never came lingered in memory rather than celebration. There was no space to move on, not with unanswered questions still hanging over everything. David's parents found themselves caught between remembering and trying to heal. His mother spent hours flipping through old photo albums, savoring small details. His handwriting in a birthday card, the way he leaned into Ellen with quiet affection. His father, once a strong figure in the family, aged quickly under the pressure of grief and helplessness. He had been raised to believe that every problem had a solution if you worked hard enough. This case challenged and ultimately shattered that belief. Ellen's family struggled in their own way. Her mother attended every remembrance ceremony the community organized in the first 5 years, then took over organizing them when interest declined. She made sure Ellen's name wasn't forgotten, not by the town, not by the state, and especially not by law enforcement. She would call the sheriff's department once a month without fail, even on holidays. Sometimes the conversations would last 10 minutes, sometimes only 30 seconds. The message was always the same. Please don't let this case disappear. Her father became more withdrawn, hiding his heartbreak behind yard work, chores, and silence. The image of walking Ellen down the aisle, an image he had cherished for years, now became a reminder of what had been stolen. Grief didn't break him all at once. It chipped away slowly. The detectives who had worked the case early on carried their own frustrations. Some would reopen the files late at night, rereading witness statements and timelines. They weren't obligated to, but they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the answer had to be in the evidence somewhere. Yet each time they reached the same conclusion. Without a lead, there was no direction to push. Years passed, and then decades. The world changed. New technology appeared, but resources were stretched thin. Without a fresh lead or evidence that required retesting, funding for processing older cases was rare. The murders remained stuck between eras. Too old for active focus, too unsolved to forget. Still, hope didn't vanish completely. Every time advances in forensic science were announced on national news, the families took notice. Every time DNA technology appeared to break open another decades-old case somewhere else in the country, both families wondered if it could happen for David and Ellen too. They clipped articles about breakthroughs, saved newspaper stories about arrests made through new forensic tools, and occasionally mailed them to investigators, gentle reminders that they were still waiting. Even after 40 years, both families spoke about David and Ellen in the present tense. Not because they believed they were still alive, but because their memories had never become part of the past. To them, the couple remained young, full of dreams, and deserving of justice. The park changed with time. New signs were posted. Trails were remapped. Parking spaces expanded. But the section where the bodies had been found was mostly untouched, as if nature refused to let it be forgotten. A few locals claimed the place still felt different, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Others avoided it out of respect or superstition. It wasn't fear that kept people away. It was a solemn acknowledgement that something deeply wrong had happened there. Meanwhile, the boxes containing the case files sat on shelves, organized, preserved, and waiting. They were pulled down occasionally, dust brushed off, pages reread. The moment DNA technology began changing criminal investigations nationwide, detectives looked at those boxes differently. Still, no one made promises. They knew better than to raise hopes without certainty. But the families, despite exhaustion, despite heartbreak, held on. Hope wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet and painful. It looked like keeping the same phone number for 40 years, just in case law enforcement ever needed to call. It looked like setting a fresh flower next to a gravesite every week without fail. It looked like honoring birthdays that would never be celebrated again. Some people outside the case wondered why they didn't let go, why they didn't try to move on. But closure wasn't possible without truth. It wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about healing wounds that had never been allowed to close. Behind every cold case are families waiting, not for rewinding time, not for miracles, but for acknowledgement and answers. Do you think the families of cold case victims should ever give up hope? Let us know what you think in the comments. More than 4 decades after the murders, the case files were the same, but the world was not. Technology had evolved in ways investigators in 1976 could never have imagined. Fingerprints were no longer the gold standard. DNA, once considered revolutionary on its own, was now being pushed further by a new wave of forensic tools. And it was this progress, not luck, that finally reignited the investigation into the deaths of David and Ellen. In early 2019, the Marathon County Sheriff's Department received a proposal from a private laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy, a technique that combined DNA testing with public genealogy databases to identify biological matches. It had already been used to crack open several high-profile cold cases across the country. To the detectives who had once believed their case would never move again, it felt like the first real spark in over 40 years. The evidence from the crime scene, painstakingly preserved through decades, contained DNA that didn't belong to either victim. For years, scientists had compared it against criminal databases, hoping the unknown profile would match someone who had been arrested later in life. No match ever surfaced. The profile remained anonymous, a ghost. But genetic genealogy didn't rely on criminals. It relied on relatives. Analysts uploaded the crime scene DNA to approved databases where individuals voluntarily submitted their DNA to explore ancestry. The goal wasn't to find the killer immediately. It was to find family, a cousin, A distant uncle. Anyone whose DNA could form a connection strong enough to map a family tree backwards until a single branch led to the person responsible. When the results came through, they were unexpected and electrifying. The genetic profile connected to several individuals in northern Wisconsin. The genealogy team spent weeks building out their family relationships with census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and birth logs. The branches tightened. Generations filtered down through records and timelines until one name sat at the center of the probability chart. This wasn't solved by luck. It was solved because people refused to give up. If you believe more families deserve this kind of justice, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so these stories don't get buried again. Dennis Van Nieuwenhoven. The name didn't appear in the original investigation files. He had never been a suspect. He had never been interviewed. Yet the data pointed directly to him, not by speculation, but by biological certainty. He had lived in the area in 1976, not far from McClintock Park. He was 24 at the time, roughly the same age as David and Ellen. That detail alone was unsettling. The case wasn't pointing to a seasoned criminal or an outsider passing through. It pointed to someone who had been part of the same community and who had lived alongside the memory of the murders for decades afterward. Once his name surfaced, investigators needed direct DNA from him to confirm the match. They approached carefully. Nothing could be rushed after so many years of waiting. Law enforcement reached out under the guise of a routine administrative matter and collected a small genetic sample. To the outside world, it looked unremarkable. To those who had devoted their careers to the case, it was the moment everything hinged on. When the lab results arrived, no one in the room breathed for several seconds. The crime scene DNA and Van Nieuwenhoven's sample matched. There was no margin of doubt. Not a partial match. Not a possibility. A full genetic match. For detectives who had carried the weight of this cold case for most of their adult lives, it was difficult to absorb. Some stared at the printed report in silence. Others felt a swell of emotion, relief, disbelief, and sorrow intertwined. The answer they had been chasing for 43 years was finally in their hands. Investigators tracked down details of Van Nieuwenhoven's life since 1976. He had remained in Wisconsin. He built a family, worked regular jobs, never appeared in police records for violent offenses. There was nothing that outwardly explained how he could walk away from a double homicide and resume a normal life. But the DNA didn't leave room for interpretation. Whatever life he had built, whatever facade he had maintained, the truth, long buried, had finally surfaced. Detectives informed the families first. There was no simple way to deliver the news. It wasn't closure, not yet. But for the first time since the murders, there was direction, something to hold on to that wasn't just faith or memory. It was a moment of validation for the families, but also one of emotional complexity. Justice was finally within reach, yet painfully late. After decades of unanswered questions, the investigation was no longer abstract. It pointed to a living man, walking free, connected not by theory or rumor, but by science. A man who had outlived suspicion, not by innocence, but by time. The wheels of justice began to turn once more. Everything that followed, the arrest, the trial, the verdict, would begin with this moment. A modern technology applied to an old crime, proving that even when years bury truth under silence, science has the power to unearth it. The case of David and Ellen was no longer cold. It was active, and it was personal. Do you believe genetic genealogy is the future of solving cold cases? Share your thoughts below. Once the DNA results confirmed that the profile from the crime scene belonged to Dennis Van Nieuwenhoven, the investigation shifted from symbolic to urgent. The case that had remained frozen in time for 43 years was suddenly active again, and the pressure to move forward quickly was immense. Investigators knew that the families had waited far too long already, but they also understood that every step had to be airtight. They couldn't risk the possibility of contamination, error, or a misstep that might jeopardize the case. A task force was assembled, bringing together detectives who had worked the case years ago and newer officers trained in modern investigative techniques. They shared one mission: verify the match, dig into the suspect's history, and prepare to make an arrest that would stand unshakable in court. The first order of business was learning who Van Nieuwenhoven had become after 1976. Records showed that he had remained in Wisconsin his entire life. He hadn't run, changed his name, or attempted to disappear. He married. He raised children. He worked steady jobs. He lived what appeared to be an unremarkable life. Part of that simplicity made the match unsettling. It wasn't the profile of a man running from a violent past. It was the profile of someone who had never been caught. Detectives ran his employment history, criminal record, and known addresses. Nothing stood out. No violence. No behavior that hinted at a dark past. There were no known conflicts with David or Ellen. They didn't share workplaces or social circles. So far as investigators could tell, their paths never crossed before that night in McClintock Park. But the DNA didn't lie, and there was no alternative explanation that fit. The reality was difficult to process. A man who built a family and attended community events, who lived among neighbors without raising suspicion, had carried the truth of a double murder for decades. Law enforcement secured a warrant for a direct DNA collection to confirm the genealogical match. They proceeded with caution, aware that a confrontation could become dangerous. The sample collected weeks earlier under routine pretense was now compared to the DNA from the murders. When the forensic laboratory delivered the report, there was no ambiguity. The genetic profiles were identical. The scientific confirmation removed any last trace of doubt. Once the match was verified, an arrest plan was coordinated. Officers drove to the modest home where Van Nieuwenhoven lived, a quiet residential street like any other. Nothing about the house suggested scandal or danger. A family vehicle sat in the driveway. The yard was tidy. Curtains were drawn, but not in a way that seemed suspicious. It could have been anyone's house. The arrest took place without incident. When officers approached, Van Nieuwenhoven appeared stunned but not combative. His confusion seemed genuine, but whether it was shock at being discovered or an attempt to feign disbelief, investigators couldn't tell. The entire neighborhood watched from behind windows and curtains as a 76-year-old man was escorted into a police vehicle. The news of the arrest moved faster than anyone anticipated. Within hours, the phones at the sheriff's office were ringing nonstop. The community that once feared the murders had long since settled into the comfort of believing the answers might never come. Now those answers were back, in the shape of a man who had lived among them without suspicion. Detectives met with the families as soon as the arrest became public. Emotions ran high, not from relief alone, but from everything that had been endured along the way. There was validation. There was disbelief. There was anger at the time that had passed. A mother asked quietly how many birthdays her daughter's killer had celebrated during the years she'd spent visiting a grave. A father stared at the wall in silence, absorbing the weight of the moment without speaking. The shock extended beyond the families. Former classmates, old neighbors, co-workers, all tried to reconcile the person they remembered with the crime he now stood accused of. For many, he had been unremarkable, quiet, polite even. Some had known him only casually. Others realized they had known him better than they were comfortable admitting. People replayed interactions in their minds, searching for warning signs that had never been obvious. In the days that followed, investigators reflected privately on the magnitude of the moment. They had spent decades searching for a lead that always seemed just out of reach. Now the solution had arrived through scientific progress rather than detective work alone. It was a reminder that some answers simply require time. Time for technology to advance. Time for science to catch up with truth. The arrest did not erase the pain of the past, but it illuminated a future where accountability, once unimaginable, was finally possible. After 43 years, the story no longer revolved around unanswered questions. It was now focused on a man who would finally face consequences. There were still many steps ahead: hearings, evidence presentations, testimony, legal debates. The trial would demand strength from the families and endurance from investigators. But the direction was clear, and for the first time since 1976, justice felt within reach. After the arrest, the case no longer sounded like tragedy without explanation. It sounded like a story headed toward resolution. How do you feel about the use of DNA databases to solve crimes decades later? Is it justice or an invasion of privacy? The courtroom filled early on the first day of the trial. Rows of benches were occupied by reporters, community members, retired detectives, and people who had quietly carried the memory of the case for decades. But no faces carried more weight than those of the families, David's and Ellen's, sitting just feet behind the prosecution table, waiting to see the man accused of taking their children's lives 43 years earlier. When Dennis Van Nieuwenhoven entered, the room fell unnaturally silent. He walked slowly to the defense table, assisted slightly by a deputy. Age had changed him, but the gravity of his presence wasn't lost on anyone. Some family members looked down rather than toward him. Others didn't blink, unwilling to look away now that the person responsible was no longer a faceless mystery. The prosecutor addressed the jury first. There were no theatrics, no dramatic pacing, just a clear explanation of why they were all there. The jurors were reminded that this case had been unsolved for decades not because there were no answers, but because science had not yet been capable of revealing the truth. Then came the words that anchored the foundation of the trial. The DNA found on the body of the victim, preserved from 1976 until today, matches the defendant with statistical certainty. The opening statement wasn't meant to shock. It was meant to establish inevitability. The prosecution presented the story step by step, beginning with the crime scene. Photographs were displayed on a large monitor. Even though the images were carefully selected to avoid unnecessary distress, they still carried the weight of tragedy. The jury listened to descriptions of the quiet campground, the untouched tent, and the precision with which the couple had been attacked. The contrast between peace and violence hung over the room. Then the heart of the case was presented. The DNA timeline. A forensic expert explained how the evidence from the crime scene was preserved through the decades, tested repeatedly, and ultimately matched not through criminal databases, but through genetic genealogy. They mapped out how distant relatives in public DNA databases formed a tree of potential connections until the branches led directly to Van Nieuwenhoven. Every juror paid close attention. Not because they needed convincing, but because the method felt too groundbreaking not to try to understand. After the scientific testimony, investigators who had worked on the case returned to the stand. Some had gray hair now, some had retired, some had even returned from retirement for this trial. They shared memories of the crime scene, of promising David and Ellen's families they would never stop looking for answers, of nights spent reviewing files they feared might never lead anywhere. When one detective paused mid-sentence, struggling for composure, the courtroom held still. He looked toward the families briefly before continuing, an acknowledgement of the years they all lived with the same unanswered questions. The emotional toll on both families became more visible as the trial progressed. Some wiped tears quietly. Some squeezed the hands of those beside them. Others focused intensely on every word, holding on to the idea that after decades of silence, the truth was finally being spoken aloud. The defense tried to challenge the timeline, suggesting gaps in the evidence, arguing that the DNA didn't prove intent or motive. They called attention to the defendant's life afterward. No history of violent crime, no fleeing, no attempts to hide. Their strategy wasn't to prove innocence, but to introduce doubt. At one point, Van Nieuwenhoven's attorney argued that the shooting may have been impulsive or reactionary, not deliberate. The idea lingered just long enough to stir discomfort. But the prosecution returned to the facts. 2 victims, shot separately, with no sign of struggle or threat. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't panic. It was control. Throughout the trial, Van Nieuwenhoven rarely reacted. He sat motionless, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, but otherwise detached. He did not apologize. He did not speak to the families. Whether it was indifference or calculation, no one could tell. The closing arguments brought the emotional weight of the case back into focus. The prosecutor did not make the jury guess about motive or speculate on psychological explanations. Instead, they pointed to the evidence and the silence that followed the crime, a silence that lasted 43 years while families lived with grief. When you leave this room, the prosecutor concluded, David and Ellen will still be gone. We cannot change that, but we can decide whether the truth matters. As the jury left to deliberate, the family stayed seated, hands folded, eyes fixed on the empty jury box. Some prayed, some stared straight ahead, some leaned on one another, exhausted by the emotional toll of the trial, yet unwilling to break down before the verdict arrived. Hours passed. The courthouse echoed with the kind of quiet that amplifies every sound. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening in the distance, whispered conversations. When the jury finally returned, every person in the room stood. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the judge. A breathless pause settled over everyone. When the verdict was read, Tears came without hesitation. Some families cried openly, others silently. Shoulders shook, hands covered mouths. It wasn't joy. It was the release of decades of pain, anger, and waiting. Justice had finally spoken. The case wasn't over. Sentencing still lay ahead. But for the first time since 1976, the question of who had been answered in the place where it mattered most. Do you believe Van Nieuwenhoven's actions were premeditated or a crime of passion? Drop your thoughts in the comments. When the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, it rippled through every person present. It wasn't shouted or dramatized, just spoken clearly by the judge, as procedure required. Yet the impact was anything but procedural. The verdict confirmed what the families had known in their hearts for decades. The person responsible for taking David and Ellen's lives had finally been named and held accountable. There was no applause, no cheers. Instead, the emotion that filled the courtroom was quieter, heavier, relief mixed with sorrow. Parents who had waited nearly half a century for justice leaned into one another, some crying openly, others exhaling slowly as if they had been holding their breath for 43 years. Siblings and extended relatives held hands tightly. The verdict brought validation, but it didn't erase the grief. It merely gave it boundaries. Van Nieuwenhoven sat at the defense table as the words sealed his fate. His face remained unreadable. He neither reacted nor looked toward the families seated behind the prosecution. Even at the moment the court declared him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, he offered no explanation, no apology, no expression of regret. For some, that absence of acknowledgement cut deeper than his conviction ever could. The trial transitioned into the sentencing phase, and the emotional weight shifted inward. Impact statements were allowed, giving the families an opportunity to speak. When Ellen's mother stood, her voice was steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. She spoke about birthdays celebrated without her daughter, about the wedding dress that had never been worn, and about the years spent staring at an empty chair during holidays. She didn't speak for sympathy. She spoke because the truth deserved to be heard. David's father chose his words carefully. He had never been someone who expressed much emotion in public, but when he addressed the court, the strength in his voice came from decades of endurance. He talked about the promise David carried, about the life he should have lived, and about the toll that unanswered questions had taken on their family. He didn't ask for vengeance. He asked for permanence, an assurance that the court would never forget what had been done. The judge listened attentively before delivering the sentence. The courtroom did not breathe until the ruling was spoken. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was final, absolute. The justice system had taken its full course, and the outcome could not be undone. Van Nieuwenhoven was escorted out quietly through a side door, away from the families and the public. For the first time since July 9, 1976, the man responsible no longer walked freely in the world. Even so, the moment did not bring celebration. It brought a soft, solemn kind of relief, one tempered by the understanding that justice could not restore the lives lost, nor rewrite the years spent waiting for answers. One mother rested her hand on her daughter's framed photograph during the recess. One father stared straight ahead, processing the conclusion of a story he never wanted to be part of. Word of the sentencing spread quickly through Marathon County. For many who had been young when the murders happened, the resolution felt surreal. The names David Schuldes and Ellen Matheys resurfaced in conversations around town, at grocery stores, in diners, on sidewalks. Some people shared memories of knowing them. Others recalled the fear that had settled over the community after the murders. Many simply expressed relief that the truth had finally come out, even if it had taken most of a lifetime. The smaller community of Wausau felt the impact as well. Those who lived through the era understood what had been lost. Young couples in the 1970s who once saw David and Ellen as a reflection of themselves now found themselves older, changed by time, yet reminded of how quickly life can shift. The arrest and conviction became symbolic, not just of justice, but of persistence. A case that once seemed doomed to fade into history now stood as proof that the truth can survive decades of silence. Some people revisited McClintock Park after the sentencing. They walked the trails with a different awareness, not out of fear, but respect. A few left flowers near the edge of the woods in quiet tribute. Others paused along the lake, thinking of the couple who should have grown old together but never had the chance. Law enforcement officers who had worked the case over the years reflected privately. For many of them, the verdict felt like the closing of a long chapter. Not because the pain disappeared, but because justice had finally caught up to history. Detectives who had retired found closure they never expected to see. Younger officers learned the lesson firsthand. Cold cases aren't truly cold, they're waiting. For the families, the relief was real but layered with complexity. Justice had been served, yet absence remained. Their children's futures were still gone. Their memories were still all they had. They walked out of the courthouse that day with a sense of completion, but not restoration. There was no starting over. There was only moving forward. Still, they walked away with something they had not possessed for 43 years, an answer. A truth anchored not in speculation or hope, but in evidence and accountability. And to families who carry the weight of cold cases on their backs, truth is its own kind of healing. How do you think the families feel now that they've received justice? Do you believe it brings them closure? In the years following the sentencing, the story of David Schuldes and Ellen Matheys began to take on a deeper meaning, one not rooted solely in tragedy, but in the legacy left behind. Their lives had been cut short in the most unjust way imaginable, yet their case became a reminder of something larger. Time does not weaken truth. It only delays the moment it is found. For decades, the murders had represented a painful chapter in Wisconsin's history, one that forced the community to confront the fragility of safety and the endurance of grief. But once the truth emerged, the case stood for something else: hope and the relentless pursuit of answers. It became one of the defining examples of how modern forensic science could break through barriers that once seemed unmovable. The impact extended beyond Marathon County. Cold case investigators across the country referenced the Schuldes, Matheys case as proof that cases once considered unsolvable could be revived. DNA genealogy, still a developing tool at the time, received renewed funding and interest nationwide. The evidence that had once remained silent for decades became a voice that could speak, even long after memories had faded and witnesses had vanished. Families of other cold case victims began advocating more loudly, urging law enforcement to revisit old evidence with modern tools. Detectives, analysts, and legal experts attended conferences where this case was discussed in detail. Victim advocacy groups used it as a platform to raise awareness about the power of scientific innovation, as well as the emotional importance of refusing to give up. But the legacy wasn't only scientific or procedural, it was human. David and Ellen were more than names on crime reports. They were a young couple with futures ahead of them, surrounded by love, shaped by possibility. Their lives inspired change not because of how they died, but because people refused to let their memory fade. Their families carried their stories through decades of silence, pushing for answers during a time when answers seemed unlikely. And when justice came, decades late but unmistakably real, it changed not just the course of their own story, but the lives of others who now believe that time does not erase accountability. For their parents and siblings, healing was not a moment, it was a slow shift. Grief no longer attached itself only to the unknown. It now existed alongside a truth they had fought to uncover. Holidays remained difficult. Anniversaries still stung. Yet there was a quiet difference in the way they spoke about David and Ellen. The memories hurt, but the fear that their story would remain unfinished was gone. Their legacy now rested in three places: memory, justice, and progress. McClintock Park continued to draw visitors, some of whom walked the trails because of the case rather than despite it. Where people once spoke only in whispers, they now left flowers, paused at certain overlooks, and told their own children the story. Not to frighten them, but to teach them the value of standing up for what is right, even when the reward isn't immediate. And for investigators, young and old, the conclusion of the Schuldes, Matheys case reinforced a belief that drives their work even without recognition or certainty. Persistence matters. The truth is not always immediate. Sometimes it requires patience, science, compassion, and decades of pressure from voices unwilling to be silenced. As time moved forward, David and Ellen shifted from victims to symbols of love, of memory, of justice delayed but not denied. Their lives became reminders that even when darkness interrupts the future, it cannot fully erase it. Stories like theirs remain painful, but they also serve a purpose. They remind us that justice is possible, that families deserve answers, and that lives taken too soon should never be allowed to fade into statistics. Their case closed not with celebration, but with dignity. And now, as their story reaches its conclusion, their memory stays alive, not only in the hearts of those who love them personally, but in the hearts of everyone who believes that cold cases deserve a second chance. If you've been touched by David and Ellen's story, subscribe to our channel for more heart-wrenching true crime stories, and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts on the case.